for Jesse, who was playing hide and seek with his friends and came across the barrels, it really put a damper on the experience of going out there. Made him wonder if there was other things out there. And he talked about going back out as a kid and just kind of looking in the woods. And of course, what he didn't know as a kid, in the late 80s, when he's looking for maybe more, that there was more.
That and so much more coming right up on today's episode of The Pod Spotter. Have you seen the number of podcasts out there? Don't even look. Just meet me here every Monday. I'll have a brand new podcast for you to slip on and try out before you drive it off the lot. And hopefully you find it useful and entertaining. And if you do, please tell your friends to subscribe or follow our little pod. Word of mouth really helps. Visit thepodspotter.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at thepodspotter for extra content and info on upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Then you can like what you see. Like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's really a pleasure. I've been screening hundreds of podcasts. Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 23-33 and a girl aged 8-10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10th, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care. For over 3 decades, this epitaph could be read on an unmarked grave in an Allenstown, New Hampshire cemetery. A hunter found the bodies in a metal 55-gallon drum near the site of a burned-down store. The bodies were wrapped in plastic, and autopsies determined both had died of blunt force trauma to the head. Fast forward 15 years, and in May of 2000, 2 more bodies were found in a similar 55-gallon drum inexplicably close to the original dump site. 4 bodies total, 1 adult, 3 children, all female. All believed murdered at the same time, found 15 years apart. Due to decomposition and lack of investigative funds, the identities of the victims would remain obscured for almost 40 years. And then someone made a podcast about it. Each week on the show, I discuss the various ways in which the medium of podcasting educates, entertains, and inspires. The really special ones do all 3. I'd put the true crime podcast Bear Brook in that category. It'll teach you about the intricate tale of uncovering the truth behind the death and destruction left in the wake of a madman. It will educate you on the new ways in which cold cases are solved using DNA and isotopes. Its delicate piano score and tight editing around enough twists and turns to fill a John Grisham novel will leave you entertained. And if you're not careful, you might just feel inspired to log on to a few genealogy websites and try your hand at cracking a cold case or 2 when you're all done binging. The plot of Bear Brook spans nearly 40 years, and while the podcast wrapped in 2018, new information continues to come out about the victims and the perpetrator. The ripple effect of Bear Brook is very much alive and ever expanding on message boards and case files all over the world. Joining me to discuss all things Bear Brook is one of the senior reporters and producers of NHPR's long-form narrative news reporting department and host of the Bear Brook podcast, Jason Moon. Thank you for being here, Jason, and thank you for sharing the podcast with us. How are you, sir?
Absolutely. I'm well. Thank you for having me.
I don't think I've gotten more requests or mentions or anything about a podcast until yours. This one is on everybody's radar, so I'm super excited to have you here and to talk to you about it. Why don't we just start with an introduction from you, Jason, and maybe a little bit about the first moment the story sort of sparked your interest back in 2015.
Sure. So I'm a reporter at New Hampshire Public Radio. It's the local NPR station. And I started at the station in 2015. just several months before I came across this story. And I'd actually started at the station on, I wasn't even full-time staff. I was on like a fellowship position because of the nature of a small newsroom, and being the kind of low man on the totem pole. I would often get thrown a lot of sort of random general assignment stories. And I just kind of happened to be the person in the newsroom when we got a press release from the Attorney General's office about new information in a cold case, and they were going to have a press conference the following day. And I went to that press conference. That's when they were talking about the radioisotope analysis. I was shocked and amazed at the things that were possible with this scientific technique. And then I talked to Rhonda Randall, who was the sort of amateur investigator, web sleuth, who had been obsessed with the case for, I think, over a decade by that point. And I started talking to her, and I think in the first 10 minutes, she told me how she had been looking for names through the phone book and was reading the phone book for so long that she became motion sick from reading for too long. And I thought, who is this lady? And I talked to Ron Montplaisir, the Allenstown cop, who was the first, law enforcement to come across the barrel, and listen to the way that he described Allenstown in the 80s and how the case really haunted him and affected him personally. And so then I had this problem, which was that I had two very different angles to approach on this one story. One was very scientific, very technical. It was about neutrons and isotopes and forensic science, and the other was about these very personal human stories about how people's lives had been shaped by what happened. It took another 2.5 years for us to release the podcast, but that's how it got started.
30 years ago this month, a mystery began when the remains of an adult and a child were discovered in a bag next to an overturned 55-gallon drum in Great Bear Brook State Park.
How this is major. This isn't somebody parking in the fire lane. This is we've got bodies, we got people. We don't even know their names. I think the most frustrating thing is we didn't know who they were.
What grandmother let this happen, or what neighbor, or what bus driver, or where were all of you?
This is a guy who was able to pick his targets and get what he wanted. And that says that is someone of terrifying intelligence.
This is the biggest step forward for solving crime since the discovery of DNA itself. We're going to look back on these 20 years, 30 years from now and say this is where it started.
Jason, you feature a little bit later on in your podcast a couple journalists who are sort of apologetic about how insufferable they are at dinner parties as a result of this story becoming an earworm. They can't get away from it. They need to sort of just keep reporting and keep uncovering and keep finding the truth. Is that sort of what happened to you early on in making this podcast? Is that just what this story does? I found myself after, just a week trolling message boards like, hey, can I find a link can I do anything? It's just the nature of the story a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that was definitely, that was something that I experienced, and something that also interested me about the story, like what you're describing, the effect just learning about the story has on people, how it turns people into obsessives, some more than others, but, Rhonda Randall, Becky Heath, are two people who probably spent, thousands of hours trying to connect the dots in the story. And I get it. It's hard not to want to know what happened.
You've spent 6 years now in the wake of, as I said, a madman, talking about, this person's motives and his actions. Is there a bit of an emotional, ramp up to just even talking to me today, to continually having to, not having to, but continually talking about Bear Brook and this subject matter?
Yeah, there's sort of for me anyways, there's the podcast, and then there's the story of the podcast. And talking about the story it's not something I generally had to do with other reporting that I worked on.
Well, there is the story of the podcast, and then there's the story within the podcast. And I think on your show, you talk about how, like, this isn't an A to B story for listeners. When you go and check this out, I think you call it it's more of think of it as a 4-dimensional shape folding in on itself. And that's probably why I have really been struggling this week with, like, man, how do I even begin to talk about this with the DNA, with all of the storylines? And so, that's all just to say, in an attempt to simplify things, I think that I'll just start with, this is a story basically of 4 interconnected moments in the Bear Brook case. The first being the Bear Brook murders in Allenstown, New Hampshire. The second, the murder of Un Sun Jun in California. The abandonment of a 5-year-old named Lisa, and the disappearance of a woman named Denise Bowden. Is that fair to categorize, or is that too reductive? But essentially, that's it.
I think that's fair, yeah.
Yeah. And you start us out in hide and seek in this bright return to nostalgia moment in the 1980s, when a bunch of kids are just running around a park when they make a grisly discovery.
I believe it was Keith that said that he found a barrel just out in the woods. There was a barrel out there.
The barrel was a blue 55-gallon steel drum. It was covered up with a lid, but whoever closed it hadn't gotten a tight seal. Something was squeezing through underneath the top. It was a plastic bag.
Scott and Keith both got off the four-wheeler, and Keith was like trying to pull the top of the barrel off. And when he got the edge of the tarp off, we got hit with like this smell of like rotten milk.
Jason, you spoke to these kids. They're now grown-ups.
Mm-hmm.
You've spoken to them firsthand. Maybe can you talk about the impact that the discovery of the barrels had on I guess not only their lives, but just the community in general?
Yeah, that was something that I really wanted to be sure to include in the story. What does this do to a small town? And for Jesse Morgan, who we heard there, who was playing hide and seek with his friends and came across the barrels. It really changed how they thought about not only their community, but the woods as a place. Sort of capital W woods. I think it sort of changed the connotations for them, and which was particularly kind of sad for Jesse and his family, because that was a big part of why they moved there. They moved to this mobile home park that was nestled right on the edge of Bear Brook State Park, so that they could use it, so that they could be outside and go camping a lot, and there's great mountain biking trails in the park, and so it really I think damaged, or at least put a damper on the experience of going out there. And as Jesse said, and I believe this is comes in later in the podcast, that made him wonder if there was other things out there. And he talks about going back out as a kid and just kind of looking in the woods. And of course, what he didn't know as a kid, in the late 80s, when he's looking for maybe more, that there was more. There was a second barrel.
It's one of the first huge twists of the pod. You can't even believe it as a listener that there is a second barrel found 15 years later, just 300 feet away, found by a state trooper, John Cody.
I ended up seeing this plastic, and I peeled it back, and then I saw what appeared to me to be a bone. And I was, of course, you're trying to talk yourself out of it, saying there's no way this is happening.
On that day, after he peered into the second barrel with his flashlight, Cody immediately called his superiors. And at first, they didn't really believe him.
I think it was probably one of those things where they figured, it's close to the weekend, they'll come out, they'll take a look. They know it's not what I thought it was, and then they'll be on their way home. But it didn't turn out like that.
Jason, you went there live and you experimented with 300 feet, the distance, in an open playing field and an open football field, and then in a wooded area. Can you explain to people who, are listening, they're like, how can this go? How can this not be found?
Yeah, this is definitely a sore subject for the state police who investigated this case, and I think they know how it looks. And their response has always been, well, it was a heavily wooded area where there were no sight lines, that you could see that far, and 300 feet in the woods is very different than 300 feet, in an open area. Not knowing what the standards were at that time for detectives in the 80s. Was there a set diameter of the perimeter that they were supposed to establish at every crime scene? Not that I was ever discovered. So, ultimately, I think what the story that emerged was that it was really a case of not a lot of resources, in a small state like New Hampshire where there's not a lot of murders. There was another murder the same weekend that the first barrel was discovered, and state police was investigating both. On the other murder, they had a lot of leads, a lot of suspects. There was a lot to do. On the Allenstown case, they had 2 bodies in a barrel without much hope of IDing them. And so I think there was a bit of, prioritizing, triaging going on.
Was there ever a time where, like, you don't really get into it on the pod, so maybe it wasn't the case, but were the cops ever suspected of, was there ever conversations about a potential cover up or anything, or the cops' culpability or any of that sort of storyline? Just because it seems so.
Yeah, not that I ever came across. More often it was just about, the incompetence.
Right? Yeah. I got to talk a little Rhonda Randall, who
Sure.
It was nice to see you light up just bringing her up at the beginning. She's probably my favorite character on the pod. She's the amateur investigator. She runs the blog, or did run the blog, Oak Hill Research. Let's introduce Rhonda and then ask a question quick.
I think right around the time my kids left home, I was looking for something a little bit different, but still in a genealogy and research world, and had come across the story of the Allenstown victims. And being unfamiliar with it, and a genealogist, I thought, surely we can turn up some identities for these folks. And that's really where it began.
Would you talk about your relationship with Rhonda and maybe some of her more impressive tactics in helping to solve this case?
She's representative of a broader, phenomenon now in culture, which is, a sort of true crime web sleuth. And she had a background in doing adoption searches, finding out the biological parents of people who'd been adopted. So she had, a real research background and just, I think, like a real interest and love for it. Before she was working on the Bear Brook case, she was kind of, she would do these projects as kind of like favors for people. And she told me about one, I don't think we included it, where I believe it was like a friend of hers, like a married couple. It was something to do with the way they met, that they met in school, and it somehow had to do something with a word problem in a math textbook from the 60s, but they couldn't agree on some detail about the word problem, and it was always kind of an argument between the two, and they asked Rhonda if she could figure it out for them, and Rhonda says she did. She tracked down this textbook from like 30 years ago to settle this like funny, sort of marital dispute about like their origin story. So that's the kind of like, place that Rhonda was coming from. And when she heard about the Allenstown case, I think she thought like, well, there's no way that there's not some way to find these people. She and her brother, they embarked on this massive project to try to track down everyone who had lived in the mobile home park near where the bodies were found over, I think, like a 5 or 6 year period. And this is a mobile home park that had a lot of turnover. There were people living there for, a month or two at a time. And so it was hundreds of names. And, they had a big map and aerial photo of the mobile home park pinned up on the wall in Rhonda's house. And they had, sort of every year underneath each plot and who lived there. And she did, probably dozens, if not hundreds of interviews. And then she put a lot of this, most if not all of the stuff that she was finding on her blog. And so that's how I first started to talk to her, just to kind of learn more about the case. But then, eventually I got really interested in the way that the case was, affecting her personally, and not just her, but, her and her relationship to her brother, who, from their telling, didn't really have much of a relationship before this case, but they kind of bonded over their shared desire to find answers. And she just, Rhonda just provided a terrific example of someone to explore this broader phenomenon of people who really get obsessed with a true crime story.
And what is law enforcement's relationship with people like Rhonda, with these armchair sleuthers? And maybe Rhonda has helped change the perspective of how they're treated.
Yeah, my sense is that it really depends on the agency, and I think it may be changing. I think traditionally, historically, it was an eye roll and a thanks but no thanks kind of approach from law enforcement.
That's what TV would tell me. That's what.
So. Right, but it's undeniable. In the past several years, the examples of the impact that citizen sleuths can have on cases is pretty. You can't be ignored anymore. And I know of at least one detective who worked on the Bear Brook case, Pete Headley, out of San Bernardino, who actively works with citizen sleuth groups. He might take a project or something that he may not have time to track down. He'll take it to one of these groups and say, "Hey, can you find a date of birth for this name for me?" So, yeah, I think that it wasn't necessarily a friendly relationship, but it wasn't antagonistic either.
I want to dip our toes into some of the science behind how the identities were found on your pod, but I'm going to definitely need some hand holding here. But this clip from episode 3 is where we learned for the first time that officials are using something brand new to help solve the Bear Brook murders. Let's listen to a little bit about radioisotopes.
So today we want to announce results of new radioisotope testing that has been conducted on the bones, the teeth, and the hair of our 4 unidentified persons.
Now, you go to great lengths to talk about how hard it is to solve cases when there is no identity. I guess how are murder cases traditionally solved, followed up on, and how is that different in the sort of Bear Brook case when they're using atoms?
Yeah, right. So the simplest way to think about it is just to look at the statistics that most people who are murdered by people they knew. So if you are a homicide detective, the simple sort of first step is to identify your victim and then find out who they knew. Draw a circle, so to speak, around their social interactions, their family, their friends. Your suspect, your perpetrator, is 9 times out of 10 is inside that circle. Obviously, the problem with the Bear Brook case is you have 4 victims with no identities, so you don't know where to draw the circle. So you don't even have a pool of people to begin with. It could, basically be anybody. And therein is the kind of original problem of the case, and why, any case where you don't have a victim ID it just becomes extremely hard to solve it. So that's why they, turn to these techniques like radioisotope analysis that were sort of their last only avenue to go down. They had tried everything else that they could think of. They looked through all the, campground records at the state park. They looked through school records for evidence of the children. There were no missing persons reports that matched the description of the victims. And the isotope testing was, happening, in 2015. So, some 35 or 30 years, on in the case. So this was kind of a Hail Mary in a way of, sort of forensic science, like maybe this will turn something up. But, as we discussed, the isotope analysis, it's not like that gives you an identity. It gives you, general geographic areas of where these people likely, lived, where they likely grew up. And I think the plan at that point was to, narrow down the geographic area of where the victims might have come from, and then target their kind of media outreach in those areas. Maybe put some billboards up in those parts of the country with the composite images of the victim, hoping to generate a tip.
And isotopes are essentially just they're atoms, and through those atoms you can identify what part of the world you're living in based on what you've consumed, based on if you've used unleaded gasoline. Like, this was some of the most fascinating stuff that I was listening to.
When I learned that about our use of leaded gasoline, left an isotopic trace all over the planet that we have all absorbed. When I learned that, that's when I really was convinced that there was a interesting story about the isotopes to tell.
Isotopes found in hair, on the other hand, tell a different story. Because hair grows continuously, it provides a record of the recent past. Each strand of hair is like a timeline of the final months of someone's life. How far the timeline goes back depends on the length of the hair. And because hair grows pretty quickly, it records changes in someone's environment with a surprising level of detail. In a case from Seattle, isotopes from an unidentified victim's hair showed she'd been moving back and forth from two regions several times in the last few months before her death. That information helped police match her to a missing persons report and ultimately to identify her.
So my teeth isotopes are never going to change because they were formed when I was young. My hair varied. Wow, this is wild stuff. Could a person essentially change their isotopes to get away with murder? Do you think that's going to happen in the future? Where a person just orders a bunch of food from Bangladesh as an alibi? Because if this is being used to put people away, are we going to get to that point?
That's a great question. Maybe,
I feel like that's going to, the next Sherlock Holmes film is going to feature isotope deception of some kind. Well, they said it couldn't be done. They said I couldn't gamify this subject matter, but darn it, I stand upon tradition. I'm going to do it with a segment I call How Well Do You Know Your Pod that we play on our podcast. I am going to gamify some of this. I'm just a scumbag, and I'm just going to make a game of your horribly tragic podcast. In this segment, How Well Do You Know Your Pod? 3 questions about your podcast, Jason Moon.
All right, I'm ready.
And based on whether or not you answer them correctly, your pod swag, in this case, a Bear Brook license plate, will be featured on the pod wall of swag behind me.
Ready.
It's nice to see you still remember the science. The first one will be a science question. What is the difference between autosomal DNA and familial DNA testing?
I can remember this because it took me months to figure this out. Familial DNA is much more limited. You can only find I think like immediate family members. Autosomal DNA, you go out to like third or fourth cousins, and that's the kind that 23andMe uses and Ancestry.com. Familial DNA testing is what some law enforcement agencies do with their existing DNA databases, but it's a little bit more. It's kind of like the precursor to the autosomal DNA searches.
Let's have a listen.
The big difference is that autosomal DNA tests are much, much more sensitive. When police run a familial DNA test, they're usually examining 20 different genetic markers to see how well 2 samples match. Think of it like a low-resolution photograph. It's why familial testing can only detect close family members. And by contrast, the autosomal DNA tests being offered by genealogy companies today examine more than 700,000 markers on each DNA sample.
Why aren't we all just using autosomal? Why do they even... is it more expensive? Is it a more expensive process?
No, it's that the familial DNA is because the law enforcement DNA databases, they don't actually contain enough information for all those markers. They're much more limited. Like they only keep those 20 data samples, so they can't do it even if they wanted to with, like, say, the FBI DNA database.
Got it.
That's why these private databases are so sought after now.
Yeah. Well, 1 out of 1. Let's move on to question number 2. What is know any good fishing spots shorthand for in the police world?
That was Ron Montplaisir's perhaps quasi-legal investigative technique to get information out of local informants.
Know any good fishing spots? Let's have a listen.
We used to call it, let's go fishing. You know, you'd make a motor vehicle stop and you knew somebody that may have known some information about a crime. My line was, you know any good fishing spots? And they knew what I was talking about. We weren't actually going fishing, but, that meant the difference between, either receiving a warning or receiving a summons or just helping me out. And there was always somebody that knew a good fishing spot. Always.
I love the characters of your podcast. That's Ron Montplaisir. It is just so rich with interesting humans. 2 out of 2 correct. I got to stop here before the third one because this one will be a spoiler alert. So stop if you haven't binged the pod yet. Go binge it, then come back and listen to the rest of our conversation. Spoiler alert for question number 3. See if Jason Moon's swag is getting on the swag wall behind us. But Jason, how many aliases can you name that the chameleon used over the course of his life?
Let's see. Curtis Kimball, Jerry Mockerman, Bob Evans, Larry Vanner, that might be it. I think there's 1 or 2 more, but I can't remember.
Wow. That was 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 5 that we heard.
5.
Gordon Jensen was the last one. Real name, of course, Terry Rasmussen. 4 out of 5. That is enough, but you've got 2 out of 3 perfectly correct. So you're definitely going on the wall. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
We haven't spoken really about Terry Rasmussen until now. I kind of was following your lead on the podcast where you deliberately don't focus too much on the killer and make it more victim-centric. And I think that is why that contributes to a big reason why so many people love your pod. It's very tasteful and it's tactfully done. And I maybe just talk a little bit about the decision to do that, to not feature Terry so much and to just focus on the victims.
I'm the person who's going to call the family members of the victim, right? And cold call these people and make a pitch to them of why they should talk to me for the story I'm doing. And in that moment, you really need to have a good reason for why you're doing a true crime story. And so, when I talk to, Elaine Ramos, Unsunjun's cousin, part of what I told her was that, we want this story to be about the victims. I don't want the story to be Terry Rasmussen, born in Arizona and went in the Navy and had what a, interesting, mysterious life. And then he became a serial killer. And look, he had this victim and that victim along the way. We wanted Unsun to be, a 3-dimensional human, with depth and character to her. We had seen what the alternate looks like when the story does, kind of focus on and, some can come close to kind of like fetishizing, serial killers. And that was just something we didn't want to do.
Well, that being said, I'm going to totally just disregard the advice and now play a little audio from the killer who you actually feature. But it's the one time we hear from Terry Rasmussen.
I've always tried to live by the model that there's no defense against the truth. But sometimes it's hard to find out what the truth is. You got one side, the other side, and something down the middle that people might perceive to be the truth.
Or he would tell rambling stories that seemed to be building to a point that never came.
When these guys get a chance to go to work for the Forest Service for $28.50 an hour, paid 24 hours a day, I got to eat small meals about 4 times a day, 5 times a day. If you had a pair of shoes and you were close to fire, you get, what would you call it? You get, park your car, mister, you're going to be a firefighter.
Yeah, nothing really interesting there. I don't I didn't miss him at all, you know, from your podcast. Is there not a lot of audio or video of him, or so little exists because of that decision to not focus on him?
No, it's both. That was the only audio that we had access to. We were at the mercy of, I believe that tape comes from San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, where they were interrogating him, and we made a public records request for more of that tape, but we're denied. So what we have is basically, I think it was only like a 2-minute kind of collection that they put out into the world as a way of trying to generate tips, like, you know, do you recognize this man? Do you recognize his voice, his mannerisms? So we only had access to those 2 minutes, but in the end, I think it was fine because it was just enough. Nothing that he voluntarily, gave over was of any use. So it would have been sort of a rabbit hole, just for the sake of kind of being with this serial killer, and we would have tried to avoid that anyways.
Are there any other storylines or any other leads or any other plot points that you weren't able to gain access to, that maybe didn't make it into the podcast, that you would have liked to have made it into the podcast, but just couldn't because you didn't have access to or didn't have time for?
In a perfect world, I wish we could have talked to the Deckers. That's the family that took Lisa in when she was abandoned in the RV park. They declined through law enforcement an interview with us. So, and we respect that decision, but I wish we could have had a more complete view of what happened there from someone who was actually there. As we have it in the podcast, that part of the story is basically told by the detective, Pete Headley, who got it, from the Deckers. So it's sort of secondhand. I wish we had, more insight into who Denise Bowden was. Her family also declined, they're based in New Hampshire, also declined interviews with us. And so, but those are, a couple of spots where I wish we could have had a little bit more firsthand knowledge of what was going on.
I think the most compelling interview for me, some of the most compelling audio, was your conversation with his son, Eric Rasmussen. That was an incredible conversation. Just his availability, emotionally, to talk about being the son of a serial killer. Here's Eric remembering his psychopathic father.
I remember the day that he burned me with cigarettes. I don't remember if it was 1 or 2, but I remember feeling burnt. And I remember crying, and I just remember the look he gave me. It was just so, it's hard to describe. It was like a dead man looking at you in some ways.
I hate the chameleon moniker that he's gotten, because it just doesn't, I don't know how you feel, but this isn't a person, it didn't seem like that blended into his environment. It seems like a guy who bent other people to his will consistently over and over again, but for some reason got the chameleon name.
Any of the photos that we have of Terry, don't endear you to him, and it's hard to imagine what kind of, charm or charisma he had that allowed him to do the things that he did, but he must have, there was certainly the temptation throughout the writing and production process to kind of have these thoughts in the story, in the script, and kind of wonder out loud and speculate more about Terry. And maybe we could have interviewed like a forensic behavior expert or profiler or something. But ultimately, I'm glad we resisted that, because I think in the end, you're never going to get a satisfying answer. about why.
We'll be right back. We're always looking for new suggestions on a fresh batch of pods. Please tell me what you're listening to and what hosts you'd like to hear from via thepodspotter.com or Facebook or Twitter or Instagram at thepodspotter. Thank you. What do you think the likelihood is of another episode of Bear Brook, of more victims, of Terry's story not being done?
I think it's possible. I think, we're still waiting. This is a spoiler.
Yeah. Final alert. We'll get into the ripple effect of Bear Brook from here on out a little bit. So, final spoiler alert.
We're still waiting on the identity of the fourth victim, and we'd always sort of planned that. Because that was sort of the original mystery that we started reporting on. That, in my mind, when we get the fourth name, there'll be something in the Bear Brook feed about that. I don't know that it would be like another 20 or 30 minute episode. It might just be a 2-minute, hey, like we finally know the name. But it depends on what happens and who this person was and how they, how the identity is discovered. And
it feels like this podcast could just keep going on and on and on based on all of the people that are inspired, as I kind of alluded to in the beginning, to just kind of do their own detective work. And you feature the story of Elizabeth Lamont, who, as a result of this story's notoriety, her cold case gets uncovered. And then, of course, there is the moment that all of your audio documentary professors from college probably emailed you about. And that's the moment one of your listeners, somebody who actually listened to Bear Brook podcast, helped find the identities of the unidentified victims we started the show with.
Becky knew most of the twists and turns in the case already, but she listened anyway, listened closely, for any tiny details she didn't already know about that might help her refine her search. She even kept notes of each episode.
This is the last podcast. It's sitting here somewhere.
Becky says that listening to episode 3, the one about the isotopic testing and the updated composite images of the victims, it triggered something.
I remember stopping the podcast, going back, listening to what he said again, writing it down again.
Our first child victim also found in the same barrel with her. Her age is closer to 9 to 10 years old.
Stop, go over it again.
9 to 10 years old.
Stop, go over it again.
I need to come up with a term for when the subject or the host of the podcast becomes a part of the podcast. It happens in almost every podcast I've covered. It's like the personal pod moment of the pod. This was yours. Your reporting, all of your hard work helped lead to a person uncovering the identities of the previously unidentified victims. Can you describe what that was like, getting that email or that phone call, from Becky or Barbara, for that matter?
Yeah. Of all of the, unbelievable twists and turns in the story, this one was, for me personally, the most surreal. I do remember being skeptical at first, like, is it really? Like, are you just trying to flatter me? Couldn't possibly, be, that the podcast had a role, but it did. And sort of the real kind of, in some ways, full circle moment for me was that, months later when Becky's discovery, finally became public, and the state police and attorney general's office had another one of these massive press conferences about the case. And this was like my third or fourth press conference about the Bear Brook case, started back in 2015 at a press conference. And like all the other press conferences, they had a dumb slideshow. And now I was in the slideshow by the last press conference. In describing what had happened, they said Becky Heath is this. She listened to the podcast, and she sent him a tip. And that was a real kind of, hair raising, is this real kind of moment.
Not to mention there are probably family members and people that have been digging into this case for longer than you, sitting around you.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have felt pretty gratifying, must have felt pretty amazing and conflicting at the same time. Of like, it stinks that you have to be part of this story, but also,
it was complicated because we always felt like we needed to be one step removed from the sort of investigation into the crime. It's clearly a case where, unlike a lot of other topics that I might report on, where there's like, different opinions and different sides, and of course I try to stay as neutral as possible as a journalist. With Bear Brook, obviously there was no controversy in saying it'd be nice if the crime was solved and the victims were identified. But that said, we still needed to, we weren't on the same team as Rhonda or state police. In my mind, those were people who were actively trying to solve the crime. I was not. I was trying to cover the efforts to solve the crime. And I think it's a maybe subtle, but I think an important distinction because, once you cross that threshold, then it could compromise my ability to report on Rhonda or report on Becky in a fair way, and so when the podcast became a part of the solving, that kind of, it made me a little bit tense about kind of crossing that threshold in a way.
The podcast helped solve the crime. Listeners help figure out the identities of the victims. And listeners also propped up Bear Brook when Bear Brook needed funding because they enjoyed the episode so much. Money starts pouring into NHPR. I mean, that must have also been a nice little feather in your cap when donations started coming in.
Yeah, it was extremely flattering, and it was also a lesson for us as a small public radio station in this new world of serialized podcasting. And I think largely, fair to say, the reason that we now have a team at New Hampshire Public Radio that's dedicated solely to doing those kinds of stories. Where, when I did Bear Brook, it was a very like special circumstances kind of situation where at the end of the reporting process, they gave me 6 months off of my beat. I had a daily beat where I was filing, 2, 3, 4 stories a week every week. And I just couldn't find time to work on Bear Brook. And we finally said, okay, like we have to clear Jason's plate if we're going to do this thing. And so they kind of shuffled things around. They backfilled me in the newsroom. I got 6 months to work on it. Wow. We put the podcast out. And at the end of the 6 months, I was back to filing stories about, I think I was the education reporter at the time. So I was filing stories about, education funding lawsuits. And
oh my God, must have been impossible.
It's a different muscle for sure.
Yeah, jeez.
But now, we have a team now that is solely dedicated to doing these kinds of stories. And I'm happy to say it's my entire job now to do them. And
it's a good opportunity to plug public radio, support NHPR, support your public radio. Anybody listening, donate because
listeners like
product, listeners like you. Product is amazing. Podcasts like Bear Brook. The information is so public; it's all out there. You had every armchair sleuther adding their 2 cents to it. I'm wondering if there were any more just odd conspiracy theories out there that were floated to you. You must have gotten some interesting tips along the way.
Yeah, I've lost count by now of especially in maybe the first 6 months post-release, of a flood of theories. Well, have they thought of this? Did you try that? What about that? There were also there was a delicate situation near the end where when in that period between when Becky and Barbara Ray-Venter both identified the victims basically at the same time. I think that was in like November or December maybe of 2018, and then that information wasn't made public until, I think, like the following June. So there was like a 6 months where like I knew the names, Becky knew the names, Rhonda knew the names, and a handful of other people in this kind of citizen sleuthing world knew the names. We made the decision, MHPR did journalistically, to not report it until it was confirmed through DNA testing, which is why we waited for that press conference for so long. That's the final episode. But in that 6 months period, there were a lot of people who were in this like citizen sleuthing community who were not necessarily directly involved in finding the tip, but who were making themselves involved and were contacting the family.
Oh boy.
I think it became very confusing for the family members of the victims, who was who did what. That was a delicate kind of landscape to navigate during those 6 months while we were trying to, wait until we could report, the names of it. So
the families of the victims leads me to sort of one of my two big takeaways from your pod seems to be, if you have that relationship in your life, someone in your family who's estranged, check up on them. Just put out a feeler and be doggedly persistent, and just seeing like, hey, are you okay? Seems to be a huge takeaway from Bear Brook. And the other one is, give your DNA to 23andMe or one of those sites, because it could potentially help solve a murder that hasn't even happened yet. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. When I first started reporting on it, what interested me in part was this forensic science, and also this question of like, well, how can a whole family go missing and no one report them? That seems so unusual and crazy to me in 2015. By 2018, when we were putting out the podcast, it no longer seems that unusual to me, because you see that story play out, at least 3 times, over the course of the series, where Terry is able to estrange women from their friends and family.
Yeah.
And, it's actually, just not even just within Terry's life, but I think it's a more common thing than we would like to admit, I think.
Make amends, call your family, tell them you love them. Doesn't matter. Get over it. Anything to offer to the Podcast Hall of Fame when that's inevitably built? There will be a Bear Brook kiosk, and customers will walk in and press a little red button, and a sound will play. Do you have any hope for that sound? An interview, a piece of music, anything from your podcast?
Maybe something from Mont Pleasure. When I think about Bear Brook, his voice comes to mind. When he's talking about the country music on a Saturday morning, I think he says, but he's quick to point out that he likes country music as well. Something about talking to Ron, it was just so evocative of a place and time. It really just sets the scene for where all of this happened. And I hope it's like, in a way, I'd like to think that a small side effect of the series is like, not exactly like a tribute or an homage to, and it's like an appreciation of like these small weird towns in New Hampshire that have, just colorful people, just interesting people.
In Bear Brook Gardens, the Morgans were the center of gravity for the community. They threw the big barbecues, had all the neighborhood kids over for sleepovers.
We were all just friends.
Yeah.
And we helped each other. I can remember helping people cut wood.
Yeah. And Eddie,
on a hard winter, there were winters 10 below up there. Was nothing in the winter. And, none of the cars in the neighborhood would start. Except for maybe one car would go. I remember going over to our friend's house, and that one car would start all our cars so we could all go to work. We were all just young families, and we didn't have money,
The Morgans don't live in Allenstown anymore, but they remember it fondly. I think in their minds, they picture it like a postcard of country living. But that's not exactly how everyone remembers it.
Well, Jason, it's the last 5 minutes of our time together, which means everyone is gone and they're doing other things now. The multitasking is over. No one is here but the two of us, which means you can pretty much just talk about whatever you'd like. It doesn't have to be about genealogy or DNA. You can tell off a former lover or a best friend or recite poetry. It's the last 5 minutes, and I will happily go first. Mine, I was thinking about today how my Bear Brook moment when I was 18. Some friends and I, we were driving down the road, and we were the first ones on the scene of a car accident. And we got out to investigate, to check it out. Turned out some guy, he was drunk driving, hit the median. He was in his car, and he was at the steering wheel, and he was dead. He was not moving.
Wow.
We were the first ones to arrive and find him there. And I just remember the stillness and the quiet of him, and how we were like, we couldn't sleep and talk about anything else for the next week. Like, we were so affected by this sort of moment in our lives. It sort of shook everyone to a place where I think it's probably the reason why I went into acting afterwards or something. Like, everyone just sort of realized the sort of frailty of it all. And, you know, it was like one of those 18. We were 18. Yeah. Wow. And it turned out he was actually like a relative of somebody that we knew in the town. And he was just peacefully lying there, you know, no blood or any of that stuff, just out and gone. Yeah. And definitely had a lasting effect on some teenagers.
Yeah,
for sure.
Wow. No kidding.
So that exactly related to the podcast. Yeah. Sometimes I like to make it about anything, but I thought I'd share that story.
Yeah, well, tough to follow that.
Dead guy story, tough to follow.
Yeah.
Go the other way with it. Just make it about, I love when I share something intimate or private and someone's like, yeah, my dog is sick and he threw up today. I'm like, really? I just told you I was a bedwetter. What do you mean your dog's sick? That's what's great about last 5 minutes. It doesn't matter. No one's listening.
No one's listening. Right. That's what the podcast metrics tell us.
Yeah. Yeah. Should be a mess. This should be a mess.
Yeah. Well, this is sort of about the podcast, if you forgive me for that. I had a real part of the experience that was most affecting to me was talking to Terry's kids, Eric and Diane. And part of the reason was because, their situation, having to grapple with, really difficult relationship with who their father was, and trying to figure out what does that say about me is personally something that I have always dealt with. Not, my father was not a serial killer, but he was, disreputable for other reasons, and was never really a part of my life. And I found myself in a couple of moments in those interviews, almost wanting to share that with him and confide, but I didn't. And but it's funny because when I described to some of my close friends kind of the story of my what happened with my father, the first thing they would say to me is "Oh, that sounds very Bear Brook." What happened? So that's always been just for me, my personal relationship to the story is has that weird kind of overtone to it that we would never have put in the story. Doesn't belong there. But as I'm sure, for listeners, some part of the story probably reminds everybody of something, and evokes something personal from everyone. And that was it for me, was my kind of empathizing and I almost wanted to tell Eric, I know, dude, it's tough.
Yeah. Well, hopefully he hears this. Hopefully he listens to this and he'll know. But I will say, that journalistic curtain that you mentioned earlier that you keep up is not probably, but is the reason why this podcast is so damn good. But I'll also say that, those moments, and it's sort of like what we were talking about earlier, those personal pod moments, I have found just from doing this podcast, leads to some of the most interesting conversations and moments of authenticity and like true, healing. Like it's something we talked about maybe in our first podcast that we featured, All the Wiser, where like, just talking about those things often provides relief not only to you but to the listeners. You probably would have been inundated with emails about people and their estranged relationships with their fathers. But that being said, like, the reason you are who you are is because you maintain that journalistic curtain, and you've created this awesome Bear Brook podcast. So I don't think you need to feel regret, and you've made amends by telling it here in the last 5 minutes when no one is listening. Right. Eric's probably not listening, but just in case
you never know.
Yeah, you never know.
You never know.
I want to have Eric take us out with my contribution to the Podcast Hall of Fame, and it is some of that audio that you mentioned where he's just sort of talking about how he sort of is making amends for the sins of his father with the life choices that he has today. That I would agree is just some of the best audio. But thank you. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for chatting with me about your pod. This is a lot of fun.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
He did so many bad things in this world. I had to do something positive, something good, not to redeem him, but to redeem myself. And so, I got a job at the VA. I figured at least I could help other vets. Maybe in an instant, maybe one word, maybe one moment, a handshake, hey, the coffee's over there. Something would make their day just a little bit more, and maybe they wouldn't push themselves over the edge,
We're always looking for new suggestions on a fresh batch of pods. Please tell me what you're listening to and what hosts you'd like to hear from via thepodspotter.com or Facebook or Twitter or Instagram @thepodspotter. Thank you. This has been Zach Robinos. Podspotter is created by the Price Brothers, produced by Oink Inc. Radio, associate producer Tori Adams, and is recorded and produced at Baker Sound in Philadelphia.